Hi, welcome to my Macro Express Pro tutorials. In this tutorial I'm going to show you an example macro. I'm going to show you how it runs and what it does, and then I'm going to go through each of the commands and describe what's going on. Now if you've watched my previous tutorials on the program and the commands of Macro Express Pro, this should be relatively familiar ground. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run this example macro by holding ctrl-alt-shift-E. So what you're going to see happen in this macro is it's going to open an Excel sheet, the contacts Excel sheet, and there are 3 contacts in there. For each contact it's going to take the name, the city, the email address, and then a message, and it's going to plug it into a form on a web page and submit it. So let's go ahead and watch that operate. Here we go. We opened Excel. We're copying each of the cells in the records, and we finished. Now it opened up the page, submitted the form, closes this form, opens the next one, submits the next one, closes that, opens the last one, and finally, after it closes, tells us how many messages were sent. So let's go ahead and open up that example macro and have a look at what's happening in the commands. On second thought, let's look at the variables real quick. So I've defined 3 integers here, message end, and then row and current row. Well, message end I'll describe a little bit later what we're doing with that. Row and current row are related to working with each row in the Excel sheet for each record. And then we have text variables. We have name, city, email, and message to store the information that we capture from Excel. You'll notice that these are arrays of 100. That means that we can work with up to 100 records from Excel at one time. And then we have clipboard. And I'll explain why we're doing that a little bit later. Okay, back to our script. So you'll notice I started with lock keyboard and mouse. And then near the end I put unlock keyboard and mouse. Now it's important that I put the message box after I unlock the keyboard and mouse, otherwise the user can't click OK on the message box. That could present a little bit of a problem. Something else that you'll want to do is when you're developing a macro, if you decide that you want to lock the keyboard and mouse while you're working with it, you'll want to include the commands lock keyboard and mouse, but then you'll want to disable them while you're working on your macro. This will make it a lot more convenient if something goes wrong or you misjudged something in your macro. Okay? With activator launch, we are going to activate this window if it exists, and if not, we're going to open it up. So you'll notice in the window title here, I used asterisk, and I have this contains wildcards checked so that I can use an asterisk, which is a wildcard. And if this window doesn't exist, then what we're going to do is we're going to execute Excel, and we're going to pass it the parameter of the file name. Now, it's important that I put this in quotes. And the reason why is because if I didn't, it would think this was one, this was another, and this was yet a third parameter to the program. Well, I don't want it to be 3 parameters. I want it to be 1, a single file name. After that, we have Excel open. Why would I do a control home? Well, if you had Excel open already and you were somewhere else in the page, we would want to control home to get back to cell A1 before we started to do the work. So that's why I did that. And then I set integer row to 0. Now what row is, it's going to count how many rows we have. And if I don't ever get a row, I want it to remain 0 so that later on when I get to plugging it into the form, I can say, oh, we don't have any rows, don't even open a browser. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to start repeating over the rows in Excel. Now, I'll bet you noticed that as I played that macro, there were 3 records and it stopped after the 3rd record, despite repeating 100 times. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, why that happened. As we come in here, we're going to simulate a keystroke, ctrl-C. If you're familiar with Windows, you know that's copy. Why did I use that instead of the clipboard copy command here? Well, I could have used clipboard copy. In my experience, Ctrl-C is a little bit faster. But then I come down here and I wait 50 milliseconds, a fraction of a second, to make sure that we got everything into the clipboard before I move forward. Next, I'm setting the variable to the clipboard to the clipboard variable. Why? Well, look here. Now I'm stripping off the control line feed. What I found as I was putting this macro together is when I copied the cell, if it had nothing in it, right here, it still thought it had something in it. But it didn't really. Well, it did. It had a line feed or a line break. Well, as soon as I strip this control line feed or line break, now clipboard equals quote quote. And we could exit knowing that there was nothing in the cell. Before, it just continued to go for every one of the 100 repeats. So with the else block, we know that there is a record that we're operating on. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and increment row. If you remember, up above we set it to 0. So now at this point here we're going to increment it, which means add 1 to it. So now it's 1. We'll go ahead and take the contents of the current clipboard, which would be that first field that we copied to test to see if there was a record, and that's going to be the name. So let's go ahead and plug that in for the name. Well, name of row, what is that? Well, currently row is 1, so the first position in the name array is where we're going to place the text that's in the clipboard. And then we want to move arrow right. That's going to take us to the next column in Excel. Wait 50 milliseconds. Let's make sure that we got there before we continue. And then let's copy again, give ourselves a delay, make sure that we got the contents, and then put that value in city, the city array. And we're going to continue to do this all the way down through message. Now, you might think, this is pretty repetitive. Maybe we should use a repeat. Well, we would use a repeat, except here we're putting it in name, here we're putting it in city, here we're putting it in email, and then message. So that makes it less valuable to try and do a repeat. With message, we did something a little bit different here. What happened is, when Excel has a value that is multi-line, like the message that we happen to have in this Excel value, it adds quotes around the text when you copy it. Well, we don't want those quotes when we paste them into the form. We need to strip them off. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first quote is easy. All we got to do is delete the first character. But the last quote, that's going to be a little more tricky. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to grab the length of the value, the length of the text, and then we're going to have to back up a couple of positions and then remove a character. So that's what we're doing here. We go ahead and put it in message array, and then we say, all right, how long is this string? As you can see, let's get the length of the text variable. And we'll place it in end. Well, now we need to back up a couple of characters, so we're going to say message end equals message end minus 2. So now we are 2 characters before the end. Why 2? I thought the quote was on the very end. Well, it almost was. Remember that line break issue we had earlier? Well, it applies here as well. So if we back up 2 characters, we back up before the line break, and then we back up before the quote. Next, we're going to, on our message row, start at our message end, which is 2 characters before the end, and delete 1 character. That would be our quote. Now that the end is removed, let's go ahead and remove the quote from the first position and remove 1 character. Now our quotes are stripped, and let's go down to the next record in Excel. Arrow down, home takes us to column A but leaves us in the row just below the record we just completed. Alright, now that we're done grabbing all of the records in Excel, we'll hit our end if and our end repeat, and we will have looped through every record. And remember, once we hit a blank record, we're going to stop and leave the repeat. So next, what are we going to do? Well, next, we'll close Excel. We don't need it anymore. And then we'll check to see if we got any records. If we got some records, then we need to repeat. So what are we doing within this repeat? In this repeat, we're going to open the website, we're going to fill in the form, we're going to submit it, and then we're going to close the browser. And then we'll do that again for each record. Well, how many records do we have? Well, we don't know, but our variable that we defined does know. So that's what we're going to plug in here, so that it repeats the number of times for every record that we have. We'll start with 1, we'll increment by 1, and then we'll plug that counter into our cur row. That way we'll know what row we're on the whole way through this loop. Next, we're going to use the website command. We'll plug in the URL. We'll use our default browser, and we're not going to use the wait for web page in this command. Why? Because it only works on Internet Explorer, and we like Chrome. So next, we're going to explicitly wait for this window to arrive. And here's the window title we're looking for. We're going to look for it for a maximum of 10 seconds. If it takes longer than 10 seconds, we're going to stop waiting. So what happens if it never does arrive? Say you don't have an internet connection. Well, that's what our if is for. In the if, we're checking to see if the window is running. Visible or hidden, but as long as it's running. And again, here's our window title. And here we make sure that the window is on top. Activate it, make sure it's the current window. And then we'll get to the name field by using 7 tabs. Now, you could use the mouse and position relative to the window and click on the name field, but I find that the keyboard provides a little more accuracy. So then we would paste the name value. You can get the variables right down here. It's a convenient way to insert them. But we don't want to specify a static number here. We want the current row. And then we will tab and paste the city, tab, paste the email, tab, and paste the message. Now we filled out the form. We want to tab down to the submit button and press enter. Now we wanted to wait about 1.5 seconds to make sure that it was done submitting before we close the window. And then we close the window. Wait another 1/4 second just to make sure that we have everything in order, everything is good. And then start the process over with a second record and third record and so on until they're all complete. Finally, we want to unlock the keyboard and mouse and display a message that tells the user how many rows or how many messages we submitted via the form. Well, that concludes my Macro Express Pro macro example. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found it useful.